Welcome. I'm so glad to have you here today for Yale's inaugural presidential lecture, and it gives me great pleasure to be here with so many members of the Yale and the New Haven community. I designed the presidential lecture series to spark intellectual exchange on issues of importance to the nation, to higher education, and to Yale. Each semester, we will bring a leading expert to campus to discuss ideas and inspire conversation on some of our most complex topics, particularly as they relate to higher education. So today, I'm honored to be able to welcome eminent economist Raj Chetty as the inaugural speaker. Raj is the William A. Ackman Professor of Public Economics at Harvard University. He is also founding director of Opportunity Insights, a nonpartisan research team that conducts analysis with big data sets in order to determine how to improve social mobility, and also works with local stakeholders to drive informed policy change. He has a very long list of accolades. I'll mention just a few here. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. He won the John Bakes Clark Medal, which is awarded annually to the top economists under 40. The Harvard's George Leddy Prize, awarded for research that made the most valuable contribution to science for the benefit of humanity. Many of you may know Raj from the now very famous research study that was focused on intergenerational mobility, especially in higher education. Leveraging de-identified IRS tax returns of parents and combining them with college enrollment and income data of students after their graduation, he was able to create a social mobility index. So tonight, this afternoon, we are looking forward to the insights that he will share about much of this ongoing research, including both national and very local data. Raj's work at Opportunity Insights brings together academic research with scalable solutions. And the goal is to influence policymakers and enable more people ultimately to be able to move out of poverty. His scholarship has not only transformed our understanding of intergenerational socioeconomic mobility, but has also laid the foundation for evidence-based policies to accelerate it. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our first presidential lecture series speaker. Please join me in extending a warm Yale welcome to Professor Raj Chetty.
Thanks so much, Maury, for the very warm introduction. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here with all of you today. Thank you all for coming. And it's a pleasure to be here, especially with many of the Yale economics and SOM faculty here who I've learned from over the years, including Joe Altanji and Kostas Magir, who do work related to issues that I'll be discussing today. So I'm especially happy to be giving this lecture at this time when there are many issues in society that people are debating, with higher education institutions increasingly under scrutiny for what they can contribute to society and so on. And what I want to talk about today is what we can do in institutions like this, in our own communities, to improve economic opportunity for everyone. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted concept that has different meanings to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here to one dimension of the American dream, which I think is a cornerstone of the American identity, the idea that through hard work, any child should have the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents. Certainly that sort of aspiration that drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants. So in this first chart here, and a study my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration by measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. Now, there's some statistical details in the background in terms of how you construct this series. We don't have longitudinal data going this far back, so there are some challenges in doing this. I'm going to skip those details, just get to the punchline. What do you see here? If you look at kids born in the middle of the last century, you can see that it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. We estimate that 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s who are turning 30 in recent years when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. Now, this broad trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself, because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we would like to understand. But I think this trend is also of fundamental social and political interest, because it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work. And if you break this data down further and ask, where do you see the most populist sentiment, for example, it's exactly in places where opportunity has faded the most. And so motivated by this trend, in the research group that I direct together with John Friedman, who's a professor at Brown, who's also here with us today at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we are motivated by the question of what is driving this fading of the American dream, and more broadly, how can we create greater economic opportunity going forward? Now, we are, of course, by no means the first group of people to be studying these issues. There's an enormous body of work in economics and other social sciences that spans decades, looking into the determinants of inequality and opportunity. Our angle on it, and a lot of the thrust of recent research in this field, has been to use large-scale administrative data, including, as I look around the room, many scholars here at Yale, big data, so to speak, to understand these questions more precisely. So what I'm going to do in this talk is show you some of what we've learned about the determinants of economic opportunity by analyzing modern large-scale data sources. So I'm going to start in that investigation by turning to this map here, disaggregating the national picture that I started out with regionally across the United States. So let me take a second to describe first how we construct this map, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we've done here is taken data on millions of children, essentially all children born in the United States in the late 1970s. We obtain information from anonymized tax returns that allows us to link them back to their parents and back to the exact location in which they grew up. We then divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas, and in each of those areas, we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families? And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define a low-income family as a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which corresponds to an income of about $27,000 a year. So to give you an example, in the Bridgeport area around where we are, kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, on average, when we look at their 1040 tax returns when they're 35 years old, are making about $33,000 a year. You can similarly compute that statistic for every metro and rural area in the US. And so now what do you see? If you start by looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side, you can see that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of upward mobility across different parts of the US. So in some parts of the US, like take Dubuque, Iowa, for example, or much of the rural Midwest, kids starting out in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later are making $45,000 or $50,000 a year on average. So quite a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. Yet there are other parts of the US, look at Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, or much of the Southeast, in the darkest red colors, where kids starting out in families at that exact same income level are making only $26,000 a year, really not a lot of progress across generations, despite starting out at exactly the same point. Now, this map, I think, is of interest for two reasons. First, from a scientific perspective, it gives us a new lens, a microscope, if you will, to study the science of economic opportunity that we've lacked in the past. When you just look at national comparisons or historical trends, it's difficult to figure out what exactly is driving changes in economic mobility because so many things have changed over the past 50 years. Here, as I'll show you over the course of this talk, by comparing why Dubuque, Iowa to other nearby places or kids who move from one place to another, we can start to unravel the determinants of economic opportunity a little bit more precisely. Second, from a policy perspective, once we have that insight, we can potentially make changes in the more red-colored parts of this map to try to provide opportunity in those areas and thereby potentially increase economic mobility more broadly. So motivated by that two-part logic, basically the way I'm going to structure this talk is in the first half, give you a quick overview of what about a decade of research by our team and many other scholars has uncovered in terms of the determinants of economic opportunity. And in the second half, talk about what we're learning about what types of policy changes can make a difference going forward to increase economic mobility. So in this national map, your eye naturally gravitates to the broad regional variation, with much higher rates of upward mobility in the rural Midwest, for example, compared to the Southeast or cities in the industrial Midwest that have lower levels of mobility and so on. But it turns out, in understanding what's going on, that the key level of variation at which these differences are emerging is not across these broad states or regions, but actually at a much more local level. So to give you a sense of that, let me now zoom in and look at these data where we are at a much more local context right around Yale. Exact same statistics that I was showing you before, but now shown at the census tract level. Each census tract has about 4,000 people. So think of this as a small definition of neighborhoods. Here we're seeing the neighborhoods around New Haven, of course. And we're calculating exactly the same statistics. Because we have data on the entire population, we have sufficient information to ask for the kids growing up in low-income families in each of these areas, how well do they do on average? Now, the first observation I want to make is that if you look at the spectrum of colors on this map, it's the same as the spectrum of colors that I showed you on the national map. And we haven't changed the color scale. So what is that telling you? You can go a couple miles down the road in New Haven, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So the roots of these differences in economic mobility are hyper-local. It's not about just state-level differences in policies or differences across cities. No, it's often about differences on one side of the street versus another side of the street, maybe the schools kids are attending, who they're interacting with, and so on, at a very, very local level. And so that maybe makes you think about a different set of explanations than you otherwise would have had the variation been at a much more aggregate level. Now, what I'm going to be interested in doing is trying to understand why exactly it is that you have such sharp variations in children's chances of rising up across areas. But before going into further detail on those determinants, I want to show another set of descriptive evidence that I think helps us understand the landscape of economic mobility in the United States, which is to look at how these geographic patterns are changing over time. Now, it turns out when you do that, it's quite important to break down the data not just by class, as we've been doing, looking at low-income people, but also by race. So in this map here, this is from a study we put out last year, building on our earlier work, basically taking advantage of the passage of time to be able to look at how these patterns of economic mobility are changing across cohorts. So in this first map, what we're doing is essentially replicating what I showed you in the very first map, taking the set of kids born in 1978, asking what economic mobility looks like, defined in exactly the same way, kids in low-income families, where do they end up on average, and focusing specifically on white children born to low-income parents, all right? So that's what the map looks like for kids born in 1978. The patterns look similar to what I showed you on the first slide. So now, let's look at what the same map looks like for kids born in 1992. So what do you see here? The red colors have basically spread across the United States. It used to be the case that if you grew up in Connecticut, for example, in a low-income family as a white kid, you'd have a pretty good chance of reaching the middle class or beyond. That's no longer true, as you can see. For kids born in 1992, your odds of doing well, your average income, conditional on growing up in a low-income family, look about the same in California, parts of the Northeast, as they do in Appalachia. So the map has turned redder, basically opportunities receding for white kids growing up in low-income families. And I think this is an important part of some of the public discourse that's ongoing in the US. Now, that's the data for white children. Now let's look at the same set of maps for Black children. So here I'm going to change the color scale for the reason that will become evident in a second. So in this map, purple colors represent lower levels of upward mobility. The peach-orange colors represent higher levels of upward mobility. A lot of the map is blank because we don't have a sufficiently large Black population in much of the US to compute these statistics. But where we do, we see that once again, there's significant variation in upward mobility across areas for kids born in 1978. Now let's again repeat that map for kids born in 1992, and you see exactly the opposite pattern of what we saw for white children. The map is turning more orange. Upward mobility is improving across the board for Black children, right? And so as a result of these two trends that I've just shown you in the past two slides, there's a narrowing of the racial gap in economic mobility, while there's a widening, it turns out, of the class gap. So low-income white kids, as we saw, are doing worse. I haven't shown you this here, but high-income white kids are doing better. And as a result, there's a bigger divide between kids with low and high-income parents. Now, while the racial gap is narrowing, I want to stress, and this is reflected in the color scale, that there is still an enormous racial gap in economic mobility and economic outcomes in the United States. And that's made evident by putting the two maps for 1992 side by side. And the point that you can see here is that if you look at the top of the color scale on the left, the places where Black kids do the best, where they have average incomes in their 30s of about $25,600, they have worse outcomes there than the places that look the worst in terms of economic mobility for white children. So there's still an enormous divide in terms of rates of upward mobility between Black and white children in America. Race continues to be a very important dividing line, but the racial gap in economic mobility has fallen by about 1/3 over the past 15 years, which is quite a substantial change given how long-lasting these racial disparities have been. So these are, I think, some of the very important trends that are occurring in the US by race and class. I'm going to make one final descriptive point on this before turning to the determinants of mobility, which is that often when people look at these maps, or sometimes in public discussions, people have a sense of one group getting ahead, another group falling behind. And there's a perception that maybe this is a zero-sum game where if one group gets ahead, it's coming at the expense of another. And my sense is that is not what's going on. And one way that you can see that is by plotting the data from the two sets of maps that I've just been showing you, the changes in outcomes across cohorts for Black kids on the y-axis versus the changes in outcomes for white children on the x-axis. And you can see that there's a positive relationship between these two things. So that is to say, in the places where outcomes have improved the most for Black children, you've seen the least deterioration for white children. If it was a zero-sum game where Black children were kind of climbing up in the ladder, leaving white children behind or displacing white children from where they were, this line would be downward sloping. But that's not what you see. And more generally, throughout our studies, we rarely find evidence of this zero-sum phenomenon. It looks more like as one group does better, other groups do better as well. And I think that's very important to keep in mind as we think about the broader narrative in terms of how to make progress on these issues. So with that background on the state of economic opportunity in the US, let me turn now to what we've learned about the determinants of economic mobility. So to do this, the first thing I'm going to do is go back to the local data that I showed you before. I'm going to talk about an analysis we've done looking at kids who move across neighborhoods to get some insight into what determines why kids do better in some areas relative to others. Now, we've done a series of studies where we've analyzed millions of children who've moved across different neighborhoods. I'm going to, rather than getting into the statistical details of those studies, just summarize what we find in the context of a simple local example. So imagine you've got a set of kids who start out growing up in West Rock, a neighborhood near New Haven, whereas you can see here it's in a dark red color. You have very poor outcomes for kids growing up in low-income families. And imagine you track a set of families who move from West Rock to another nearby neighborhood called Hamden Plains, where we see in the tax data kids who grow up there from birth have much better outcomes on average. So I want you to think about is that sort of experiment. In reality, in the background, we're looking at millions of such moves across many different neighborhoods, but this basically captures the logic. So think about a set of families making this move from West Rock to Hampden Plains with kids of different ages, okay? Starting with families who move when their child is exactly 2 years old. So what you see in the data, in the context of this example, is if you follow these children into adulthood and ask how much are they themselves making when they're adults, those kids who move at age 2 from West Rock to Hampden Plains, they're making about $30,700 per year. Okay, so that's for the children who move when they're exactly 2. Now let's repeat that analysis, looking at kids who make the exact same move at ages 3, 4, 5, and so on. So what do you see? You see this very clear declining pattern. The later you make this move from West Rock to Hampden Plains, or more generally from a red-colored part of the maps that I've been showing you to a blue-green colored part of the maps, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat and you get no gain at all. So what do you see from this study? These data suggest, I think, 3 key things. So first, where you grow up really matters for your life outcomes. So it's not just that the kids who live in these red-colored neighborhoods are different from the kids who live in the green-colored neighborhoods. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child from a low-opportunity area to a high-opportunity area, there's a significant change in their life outcomes. Here, we use a so-called quasi-experimental design to establish this fact. There are a series of other studies we and others have done using randomized experiments that get very similar results showing childhood exposure effects. So, this is an important finding because it shows that it's not just about selection, different types of people living in different places, but rather there's a causal effect of the neighborhood, the environment in which you're growing up that changes your life outcomes. I think that in and of itself is an encouraging result because it suggests that you don't need to look back to the 1950s to find a point where we had high rates of upward mobility. You can just look a couple miles down the road in New Haven and you can see that if kids were growing up in that environment, you'd have much higher rates of upward mobility. The second key thing you see is that what really matters is childhood environment rather than where you live as an adult. In this work and in many other studies, we find that if you move locally as an adult, it has very little impact on your economic outcomes. And the third thing you see is that there's a dosage effect here. The earlier you move to that better neighborhood, the better you do in the long run. Every extra year of exposure matters. It's not just that there's a critical age before which you have to move in order to get these gains. Even if you move as a teenager to one of those green-colored areas, you still have significantly better outcomes in the long run. So the natural next question, having established that neighborhoods, local context seems to have a causal effect on economic mobility, on kids' long-term outcomes, is to ask why. Why is it that some of these places produce better outcomes than others? Now here, this is an area where many people have written papers using the data from the Opportunity Atlas that I showed you earlier to correlate with various factors, historical factors, contemporaneous factors that might drive these differences in mobility. I'm going to summarize here in the interest of time the 4 strongest patterns that people have found. First, it's quite clear in the data that places with lower poverty rates, more mixed income communities, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Second, places with more stable family structures, more 2-parent families, for example, tend to have higher rates of economic mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education, tend to have higher levels of mobility. And finally, places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time on this last factor, because in a lot of our work, there's evidence that this notion of social capital is particularly important, and it interacts with a lot of these other factors that we see on this slide. So what do we mean by social capital? This is a term that social scientists have discussed for more than 100 years. The idea that the strength of the community you're in, who your friends are, what your networks look like, might matter for your outcomes, for economic outcomes, for health outcomes, and so on. While that idea has been discussed for a long time, measuring what social capital is precisely and really formalizing what is social capital, how might we manipulate it, and why does it matter, and so on, has been challenging because getting large-scale data on people's networks and friendships is very difficult. Now, once again, in the era of big data, there are ways to make progress on this. We were interested in studying social capital, and so we set up a collaboration with Meta, the company that operates the Facebook platform, to construct various granular measures of social capital for every zip code in America. And let me show you one of those measures and the key punchline that comes out of that analysis in this slide here, where the map on the left is the map that I've shown you several times now on economic mobility constructed using tax records. The map on the right is completely different. It's a map constructed using Facebook data on 72 million people and their friendships, where we're constructing one notion of social capital that we call economic connectedness. What is the share of high-income friends that low-income people have? So if you have below median income, you're on the Facebook platform, what fraction of your Facebook friends have above median income? The map on the right is colored so that the blue-green colors represent areas where low-income people have more high-income friends, and the red colors represent places with more disconnection by class, where low-income people have fewer high-income friends. Now you can see the result here immediately for yourself. It's obvious that there's an incredibly strong correlation between these two variables. This turns out to be the single strongest predictor of economic mobility that we or anybody else has identified. And we have strong reason to believe that this is not just a correlation, but it actually reflects in some significant part a causal effect of being connected to different people. First, if you control for the various other factors that people have identified, things like poverty rates or levels of inequality, racial shares, as correlates of economic mobility, this factor not only remains a highly significant predictor, but actually explains away, removes the explanatory power of many of those other factors. And second, a series of quasi-experimental studies in recent years that use things like fluctuations in the share of high-income peers across cohorts within a school demonstrate that when you're surrounded by peers who have higher income parents, you tend to have better outcomes in the long run. So our sense is this notion of connections is extremely important in driving economic mobility. Why is that the case? I don't think we really quite know yet. I think there are many plausible mechanisms you can think of. Many jobs in the US are obtained through referrals. If you're connected to somebody who's working at a high-paying firm, maybe you're more likely to get an internship or get a job at that firm down the road, which will create economic mobility for you. But even deeper than that, I think maybe a more important mechanism is that children's aspirations are heavily shaped by who they're linked to. If you've never met anyone in your community who's gone to college, maybe you never think of applying to a place like Yale or don't think about a career in science or business, et cetera. So that remains to be understood, but our sense is there's a strong connection between this notion of social capital, economic connectedness, and economic mobility. Once again, that plays out not just at the national scale, but at a very local scale. Here, zooming into the zip code level in the New Haven area, you can see that Yale is surrounded by actually a remarkably disconnected set of communities where low-income people have very few high-income friends associated with very low levels of economic mobility in those surrounding areas. So what I've just shown you here is a set of determinants of economic mobility in the cross-section, meaning in a snapshot looking across different areas. Now, I also showed you some descriptive data at the beginning on how economic mobility is changing over time. And I want to wrap up this analysis of determinants by showing you that the same idea of social capital and who you're connected to can also explain the divergent trends in economic mobility by race that I showed in the initial maps. And so to establish that, let me turn to this chart here, where what we're doing is plotting the change in upward mobility from the 1978 to 1992 cohorts on the vertical axis, here in this first series for white kids growing up in low-income families. So that's the data from the maps I was showing you before. Plotted against changes in parental employment rates in the counties where these kids were growing up. And what you can see is there's a clear positive relationship here. White kids experience the biggest declines in economic mobility in the places where their parents, looking one generation back, lost the most jobs. So think of, the industrial Midwest, the steel plants closing, the decline in manufacturing. In those places in the next generation, kids seem to have the worst outcomes. In places where employment didn't fall that much for white kids' parents, their own outcomes did not change that much, as you can see in the dot on the far right there. So that's what the series looks like for white children growing up in low-income families. Now let's look at the same series for Black children growing up in low-income families. And what you see is the pattern is exactly the same, the slope of the relationship. It's just shifted over to the right. Why is it shifted over to the right? Black folks, first of all, worked in different sectors. They were less exposed to manufacturing shocks. They were more likely to be working in the service sector, et cetera. There were also changes like the civil rights movement and other changes which increased employment rates among Black adults over this period. And as a result, Black children were growing up in counties and in communities with increasing employment rates among the Black population in the prior generation. And in particular, on the right side of this graph, when they grew up in communities where those employment rates were going up a lot, they had the biggest improvements in outcomes. So what to us is remarkable about this plot is that you can basically fit a single line through all of these data. In economics, we'd call this a single factor model. There's basically one variable that essentially explains all of the changes that we see in economic mobility by race, by class, across areas over this period. And it is the fraction of people who are working in the prior generation, the notion of how connected you are to people who have higher incomes, who are employed in your own social community. Now, when you look at this plot, you might say, okay, there's a connection between levels of employment in the prior generation and kids' outcomes. It could be because of community level effects. It could also be because if you're growing up in an area where lots of people are losing their jobs, maybe your own parents lost their job as well, and that's what's driving the worst outcomes we see on the left side of this graph. That turns out to be not what's going on. If you repeat exactly the same chart, but look at the subset of children whose own parents remain employed throughout this period, you see exactly the same relationship. So what really seems to be determinative, we find this here and in many other contexts, is the community level measure of employment rates or what's going on in the broader community, not literally what's going on in your own family. One final point on this, which I think really underscores the importance of the social connections. The employment rates that matter are not just broadly the employment rates of people in your community, but it turns out the employment rates of peers in exactly the same cohort as you. So what we're doing here is relating your own rates, your own outcomes in adulthood to the employment rates of parents, of peers of the same race in your own grade, shown by the vertical line, 2 years older, 2 years younger, and so on. And the logic here, so I'm sure if you all introspect about your high school experience, you're much more likely to be friends with people in your own grade than a grade earlier or a grade later, which is a pattern you see in the Facebook data as shown by the orange series. And if you look at the effect of peers, parents' employment rates across these different cohorts on your outcomes, it's exactly the employment rates of parents of kids in the same grade as you that matters the most in affecting your own outcome, as opposed to kids a couple grades earlier or later, which is very consistent with the idea that this notion of social capital or who you're interacting with in the prior generation is a crucial determinant of later outcomes. Okay, so having shown you a bunch of results on what we think are the main trends in economic opportunity in the US, what the key drivers are, things like social capital and so on. In the remaining part of this talk, I want to turn to how we can use these kinds of research findings, as Maury mentioned in her introduction, not just to study these issues, but actually make a difference in the world using the knowledge that we're all accumulating. In our work at Opportunity Insights, we are dividing our focus along 3 dimensions in the policy space that I think follow naturally from the set of research findings that I've shown you. So to summarize in a nutshell, a large body of research over the past decade on the determinants of economic opportunity, I think what we've learned is that the determinants of upward mobility are highly local, something like a 1-mile radius around your house. What does that environment look like? What matters is where you're growing up from birth to something like age 22 or 23. And the things that matter are things like the quality of your schools, who you're interacting with, and so on. So if you have that theory of how the world works in terms of creating opportunity, I think you'd naturally think about 3 different ways to increase economic mobility going forward. The first is to reduce segregation. If I know that a couple miles down the road in New Haven, there are better opportunities to be had, maybe I can help more low-income families move to those areas. A moving to opportunity approach that creates integration. A second approach, recognizing that moving to opportunity is obviously not a scalable policy. Not everyone wants to move. If you move everyone, there are going to be general equilibrium effects such that the causal effect of these other places will change, is what I would think of as place-based investment. Bring opportunity to people where they currently are rather than bring people to opportunity. Try to turn the red-colored parts of the map into green colors. And then the third point, which I think is particularly relevant in an institution like Yale, is how we can amplify the impacts of our higher education system on economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these before wrapping up and taking some questions. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach. So to motivate this, I want to first talk about what our existing policies do to try to reduce segregation and provide access to opportunities. So we actually spend billions of dollars at present, about $50 billion a year, on affordable housing programs in the US that are intended to give families access to better housing, perhaps in better neighborhoods that may help them ultimately rise up out of poverty. And so what I'm doing in this map here is taking that snapshot of the Opportunity Atlas data for New Haven that I've shown a few times and overlaying in the black dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. These housing vouchers are worth about $1,000 a month in terms of rental assistance. And you might notice a puzzling pattern, which is that despite the fact that these families are getting about $12,000 a year to find housing wherever they'd like, those black dots are clustered in the red-colored parts of the map, not in the blue-green colored parts of the map. So even though we're spending billions of dollars supporting these families, they're not actually moving to neighborhoods where we know from our prior work their kids would be more likely to succeed and break out of poverty. So why is that? Are there ways to make these policies more effective? So motivated by that question, when we put out these Opportunity Atlas data, we heard from a number of housing authorities that recognize this pattern. I showed it to you in New Haven. Turns out to be true in cities across the United States. Here's another example where our team has done some work in Seattle, where you see exactly the same pattern that I showed you in New Haven. You look at where voucher holders live. It's concentrated in the red-colored parts, the low mobility parts of Seattle, not the high mobility parts of Seattle. So why is this happening? We decided to team up with the local housing authorities to investigate why this is the case, to understand whether this is about barriers that are preventing families from moving to higher opportunity areas, or is it because of preferences to stay in the red-colored neighborhoods? There could be perfectly good reasons. It's closer to your job, closer to your social community. You don't want to move to the other side of the lake in Seattle. There could be other reasons besides economic mobility that you don't want to move to these higher opportunity areas. So basically, conceptually, we're trying to distinguish between whether this pattern that we're seeing is driven by preferences or is it driven by some sort of constraints or frictions that are preventing people from using these vouchers to move to higher opportunity places. So to distinguish between those hypotheses, we ran a randomized trial with about 1,000 families that came in to apply for a housing voucher through the standard process. And half of those families got the voucher as they normally do and were asked to go and find housing wherever they wanted. The other half of the families got what I would think of as basically a social capital intervention, some additional social support in the housing search process. So we connected them with a counselor who helped them find listings in high opportunity areas that might work for them. They connected them to landlords, basically someone who'd help you in the housing search process in the same way that at the high end of the housing market, lots of brokers want to help you find a house. In the low end of the housing market, that tends not to exist. We're essentially providing that service through a nonprofit. And so the idea here is to try to strip away the frictions that families might face in moving to these high opportunity areas, still give them the choice to move wherever they wanted, and see what happens. And so it's an RCT. We can follow these families over time. And what you see here is a very clear result that in the control group that did not receive that additional assistance, only 14% of families ended up moving to what we defined as a high opportunity area, basically a green colored place on the maps that I've been showing you. In the treatment group, that number jumps up to 54%, so an enormous shift in where these families end up choosing to live. Just to give you a sense of magnitudes here, this intervention costs about $2,500 a family. It's not a small sum, but relative to the treatment effects of the program, we estimate that each kid who got lucky and ended up in the treatment group rather than in the control group, they're going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes relative to the kids in the control because of the big differences in outcomes between these places. And so as an incremental rate of return, the way to think about this is we're already spending about $25 billion a year on this voucher program. This additional $2,500 a family is about a 2% incremental cost. So there's a lot of talk these days about making government more efficient. This is a case where we can gain tremendously, I think, in terms of efficiency by spending a little bit more money to make the program more impactful by providing this additional social support service on top of the existing voucher program. So I want to show that this kind of research, not only matters in these halls and discussions of, how the world works, but actually can have a quite practical impact on people's lives. So after we did this work in Seattle, there was a bill passed with bipartisan sponsors in Congress authorizing about $80 million to replicate what we did in Seattle in 8 other cities across the country. That was again done as an experimental demonstration, basically to evaluate whether the Seattle study replicates. And the results actually just came out a couple of weeks ago. And it turns out in that RCT across all the cities, you find that the same social support intervention increases moves to higher opportunity areas by a factor of 6. Very similar, in fact, somewhat larger in terms of ratios relative to what we saw in the Seattle study. Motivated by this sort of evidence, there's now another bill that's been proposed in Congress, the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, again with the Republican Democratic senator co-sponsoring it, that proposes to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year, providing these kinds of supports, increasing the number of families who receive these vouchers, and so on, that could eventually have quite a scale impact on many kids' lives across the US. So that's an example of how I think we can make our integration policies much more effective. There are many other versions of that. I focused on one case, housing vouchers. There are a number of other policies that have this flavor that I think could be designed more effectively. But as I said earlier, integration, I think, is just one piece of the puzzle here, or probably a small piece of the puzzle, because you can't really do this on a very large scale. And so in the last few minutes, I want to make sure to touch on these other areas. So how can we turn low opportunity areas into high opportunity places? How can we do this sort of what I call place-based investment? Again, let me give you a concrete example of this from a local context. So here I'm going to discuss a program called the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program, which is the biggest effort by the US federal government to revitalize neighborhoods. We spent about $17 billion over a couple of decades, taking 260 very high poverty public housing projects and revitalizing them, turning them into mixed income communities. Here's an example from a project that is 2 miles down the road here by the river called Quinnipiac Terrace, where you can see they literally demolished it and then built this mixed income development that you can drive to in 5 minutes that looks like this on the right side. So for a long time, people didn't really know, how effective was this intervention. We didn't have the data to say, does growing up in the thing that looks like what you see on the right better for kids than what's on the left? And so in work that we'll be releasing later this year, we've been using longitudinal data from the Housing and Urban Development Agency linked to tax records to analyze that question, basically comparing revitalized projects to matched control projects that look very similar or didn't get funding because there was inadequate funding. Again, I'm going to summarize in just a simple way what we find from that analysis. So think of each dot here as representing the average earnings of children in one of these revitalized sites relative to the year in which the project was revitalized. So, for example, the dot at -10 takes the set of children who were living in one of these Hope 6 projects, like Quinnipiac Terrace, 10 years before it was revitalized, following them over 30 years and measuring their own incomes in adulthood. And you can see those kids were making about $25,000 a year when they grew up. The same is true for the kids who were growing up there 9 years before, 8 years before, and so on. Now, let's look at what happens to the earnings of the kids who grew up there after revitalization. And you can see that for the kids who moved in afterward and were growing up in this revitalized community, they have significantly higher earnings, and those earnings go up as more of the community gets revitalized and the environment changes further, showing once again that it's possible to have quite substantial changes in a given place, bringing opportunity to a given place and transforming the neighborhood. A very expensive investment up front with billions of dollars spent, but our sense is the rates of return on this kind of policy are still incredibly high because of the gains for many subsequent cohorts. And so this is, again, one of many potential examples of how I think we can bring opportunity to neighborhoods effectively going forward as well. Let me more briefly now touch on the final area of higher education of particular relevance in this context, in which I think there are many things we can do to amplify the impacts of colleges on economic mobility. And so in a series of papers John and I have been writing, we've been investigating how we can do this most effectively. Much as our team has put out data on economic mobility for every neighborhood in America, we've also put out statistics on how every college in America is contributing to economic mobility. And that's what's shown on this plot here, where every college in America is represented by a dot. And we're showing two key dimensions that determine a college's contribution to economic mobility. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. This is asking, among the set of students who come from low-income families, families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, what fraction reach the top 20%? And so you can see on this dimension, places like Yale and Harvard and MIT and Stanford look terrific. The low-income kids who get the opportunity to attend these colleges do extremely well, reaching the middle class or beyond. And there's quite a bit of evidence that this is not just a selection effect. Work by your colleague Seth Zimmerman, work we've done, a number of others have shown that this is actually a causal effect. If you look at kids who narrowly get into these elite institutions, they're catapulted into the upper echelons of society. But what matters for a college's contribution to economic mobility is not merely how it affects children's outcomes, but how many low-income children you have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis, what we're calling low-income access, the share of students who come from families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And on that dimension, you can see that very few kids at these institutions actually come from the low end of the income distribution. And thus their contribution to economic mobility cannot be a whole lot mechanically as a result of that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you can see here we've highlighted some Connecticut area colleges. There are places like Central Connecticut State that do enroll many low-income kids, but unfortunately the outcomes don't look so great at those institutions. And so one way to kind of think about what the problem is in the higher education system in the US in terms of promoting economic mobility is that there are very few dots in the upper right side of this chart. There are basically very few places that both enroll many low-income kids and deliver great outcomes. And so, motivated by this chart, you can basically think of two approaches to increase economic mobility. Moving the dots that are on the upper left to the right. Can we expand access to institutions like Yale to low-income children? And there are ways you can think about changing admissions policies and things like that, some which we're going to have further conversations on, where I think useful progress can be made. And Yale has actually made quite significant progress in recent years, not reflected in these data, on that dimension. And then the other approach is to move the dots that are on the right side up and improve outcomes at those places. So how can you do that? There are a number of different approaches. I want to give you a sense of what might work by focusing on one approach, by highlighting, as a segue into that, one dot that happens to be an outlier in the upper right side here, the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology. So this is a very small college in Queens, New York. Why do I highlight it? It's illustrative of what I think is a broader theme that we could expand upon. So this is a school that's giving you, as suggested by its name, a very specific type of technical training. It enrolls a lot of low-income kids, and that occupation, aeronautics and technology, gets you to the upper end of the income distribution. More broadly, as you all know, in the US, we've focused on liberal arts education that is not so much in this vocational direction. And our sense is these kinds of programs may be a pathway to upward mobility for many children that we should be expanding further. And indeed, there are programs, sectoral job training programs like Year Up, for example, which I've highlighted here, which have been shown in randomized trials to quite significantly increase people's earnings. People who participated in this program, their earnings trajectory is shown in the green, control group shown in the orange. What these programs are doing is providing a specific type of technical training in technology, something in finance, things like that, along with social support, so connections to an employer who wants to hire for that particular set of skills. And they have really a strong record of success, and I think that's something that we could build on further going forward. So one wrap up by making two final points here. So first, again, I think these kinds of findings can have an impact, not just in the context of research, but actually on the ground in terms of changing what people do. Let me give you an example of that in the context of Charlotte, North Carolina, which I mentioned earlier, one of the cities with the lowest levels of economic mobility in America. When we put out that data, they got very animated by that issue. You see this article in the local newspaper. They formed a commission and a task force to think about why that is and what they could do to improve economic mobility going forward. And what was very inspiring to see is they didn't just talk about it, but they actually did something. Here you can see Bank of America, which was headquartered in Charlotte, led an initiative to spend about $160 million on programs like Year Up to expand workforce training. The mayor raised about $250 million for various initiatives in local schools, things like increasing connectedness and so on, to try to increase economic opportunity. And more broadly, they're very focused on monitoring economic mobility in that city going forward, which I think is having a measurable impact on improving outcomes there. And so I think what this illustrates is that change is actually genuinely possible. The final point I want to make is my interest in these issues. I suspect many of you here, lots of people come at this topic from a sense of fairness and justice. Everyone should have a shot at the American dream, no matter their background, no matter their color, their skin, et cetera. But suppose you set all of that aside, and suppose you don't care about justice or fairness, and you just care about maximizing GDP. Even then, I think you should still be interested in these issues of equality of opportunity. And I want to end by showing why that's the case, by showing you some data from a couple of other studies we've done. So here, what we've done is link data on the universe of patent records to the tax data to look at who goes on to become an inventor in America. And you can see that if you happen to be born to a family in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times as likely to become an inventor as if you happen to be born to a family at the lower end of the income distribution. And when we dig deeper, we find that a lot of the reason for that is exactly the same set of factors that I've been talking about differences in environment and access to opportunity and so on. The same goes also for your probability of starting a high-impact business, probability of becoming a successful entrepreneur. We see this exact same shape. Now, when you think about the magnitudes of this effect, turns out we have a big problem of what you might call lost Einsteins in the US, where we estimate that if women, kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds, and kids from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, you'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as you currently do. And since innovation is really viewed in economics as the engine of economic growth, I think there's tremendous potential here, not just to improve the outcomes of these kids, but to improve all of our outcomes and improve economic growth by addressing these issues of economic opportunity. And so let me end by coming back to the chart that I started out with on the fading American dream. I think you can take 2 perspectives on this trend. One is a pessimistic one, that things are really going poorly in this country. Opportunity is receding as society is becoming more fractured. And even though growth rates are high, many people are not sharing in that growth. But I hope we can take a more constructive and positive approach, as I hope I've shown you here, I think there are concrete things that we can do in our own institutions to start to change this trend. At a place like Yale, it could be engaging in sectoral job training programs. It could be trying to connect with others in the local community. It could be trying to create tutoring and mentoring programs that have been shown in randomized trials to have significant impacts. Whatever form it takes, I think the broader message is that through science and through data, I think even these complex social issues are things that we can tackle, and I hope all of you will be interested in making a difference on these issues in New Haven and beyond. Thanks so much. So I think we have a time for a couple of questions. And I think there are microphones.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm an econ math joint major here. It seems there's a pretty strong correlation between surrounding yourself with wealthier individuals and achieving upward mobility. I wonder if you could connect this to the current debate over legacy admissions at colleges. If there is a group who is disproportionately wealthier, more well-connected, do you think that then has a net benefit on the broader student population and thus can help them achieve more mobility? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, you're right that legacy admissions, it cuts in two ways. In the latter part of the talk where I showed why we have relatively few low-income kids at highly selective private colleges, at least a significant part of that is due to legacy admissions. And so on the one hand, as you note, if we did not have legacy admissions, we would likely have a more diverse student body. You're right to ask, what is the value added of these colleges coming from? Is it because of the great professors you have here, or is it because of who else you might end up being connected with? I think, both things likely matter. My intuition is that being connected to other people who are successful, who change the set of things you think about, is likely the mechanism that's very important, rather than necessarily someone whose parents are extremely wealthy in the upper tail. But that, remains to be investigated further. But I personally, I think it's plausible that if you did not have legacy admissions, you'd continue to have many well-connected kids in a broader sense at an institution like this who would create those opportunities. But I think that's the type of question we should investigate further. Take one more. Yeah, Joe.
Raj, that was a great overview. I wondered how much work you've done on the relationship between school choice and the neighborhood effects. In particular, what I wondered about is whether areas with broad school choice actually show less of an effect of the neighborhood environment.
Yeah. So we haven't done that, Joe, directly, partly because, as you know, data on which schools kids are attending, it's related to work Barbara has done as well, is tricky to get and linked to the kind of data we're working with. Maybe one thing that I can say which is related to that is that there are other studies that try to disentangle how much of the neighborhood effect is coming from schools versus other factors. So in the places where kids are following catchment boundaries and you have a sense of where kids are going to schools, you can do the movers kind of analysis that I was showing you, looking at moves across boundaries versus within school boundaries. And my sense is something like 40% of the variance is explained by differences across schools, and 60% is at the neighborhood level within school catchment areas. So surely schools are an important part of the puzzle here and explain part of what's going on. But I think there are additional neighborhood influences, even conditional on school. So that leads me to think that even if we had free school choice, we'd continue to see these neighborhood effects, but they might be somewhat smaller. Great. I think we're up on time. Thank you.
I know that Professor Chetty has given us an enormous amount to think about, both nationally as well as right here in New Haven and at Yale. And I really look forward to these conversations continuing in our community And if you can all just join me one more time, warm round of applause for Raj Chetty.